when you look at this filing from the Southern District of New York, it really hammers Michael Cohen, not only for lies, but for doing the opposite of what he had claimed and what you may have heard about on TV, that he was, quote, cooperating. But in the new filing we have, prosecutors basically say he wasn't cooperating enough, and thus they represent that he should get substantial prison time for extensive, deliberate, and serious criminal conduct. And they detail that, the willful tax evasion, the false statements to a bank, illegal campaign contributions, and of course, false statements to Congress. The prosecutors also rebuke Cohen for what they call a criminal mindset, that at his own option, he is above the laws of the United States. We've got all our experts back for this. And I want to go to Maya, who has basically worked in that office. This looks to a lot of people like a stronger rebuke than you might have expected from the federal prosecutors there. And they also go out of their way to say it wasn't full cooperation, Maya.
I think it's an understandable rebuke, quite frankly, because as I said earlier, number one, this is an attorney. This is someone who took an oath when he passed his bar exam that said he was going to uphold the laws and that he was going to hold the highest level of ethics as someone who was charged with the law. Now, what he also did was walked in, as we've said, and he didn't walk in and cooperate. He pled guilty and then started trying to cut a deal for himself that would help him out. There was some indication in some news reports that suggested that he was, in fact, holding out for a pardon and then kind of felt like he was getting thrown under the bus. And so maybe it was in his best interest to paint a different picture of himself. So I think what you're hearing from prosecutors is like, look, we don't like people who violate the law, particularly when they do it over a course of years, and then come in and try to play us. And I guess the DMX argument on sentencing didn't fly so well with them. I mean, they actually make a reference essentially to that argument that somehow he hasn't done anything as bad as some others. And, and then finally, I think they're making quite clear, while he has cooperated, it really does seem like he's done it in a way that was really about his best interest. Let me just say one other thing about why it was in his best interest. Because the district attorney of Manhattan, as well as the state attorney general, are also investigating what we're calling campaign finance law violations. They're looking at as state tax felonies and possibly misdemeanor crime in falsifying business records at the city level. So what that is really saying is you're not going to get a pardon if they find reasons to indict you at the level of the city or at the level of the state.
Sure. And look, Maya, we've discussed the DMX defense earlier on the broadcast. It says where my dog's at. No, it doesn't say that. But what it does say was, Neil Katyal, that other celebrity types and prominent people had been delinquent on their taxes and some had avoided jail time. Maybe Michael Cohen should get that light a sentence, that light a slap on the wrist. And as Maya alludes to, that was wholly rejected in this filing today, starting with the fact that they really lay out that this was not a choice of full cooperation. He was dragged to it by his decreasingly optimistic outlook of what he could get away with.
I really agree with Maya, who is a great Southern District prosecutor and has done this before. But I think I'd add one thing to what she said and what you're asking about, which is prosecutors today went out of their way to say this campaign finance violation is really severe. They didn't have to use all the soaring language they used about democracy, the threat to democracy, and the things like that. So it's pretty powerful language. And to me, it suggests that they are really steeling themselves and laying down a foundation to say, these campaign finance violations, of which there were two people involved, it was two to tango, Michael Cohen and Donald Trump, are very, very serious. And so I think there's a second move on the chessboard that's going on when you look at that filing today. And again, it's not a filing by Mueller. It's a filing by federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York that's extraordinarily significant.
And I want to bring in Jennifer Rubin and also go to a broader point. Jennifer is a Washington Post columnist and a conservative and a critic of Trump. And I don't want to wax too poetic here, but I wonder if we could begin by noting, Jennifer, that This is a president who has taken extraordinary measures, identified by his own lawyers, some of them as potentially impeachable, to try to shut down and undermine the DOJ and prosecutors and rule of law. And so I wonder if, having gone through a lot of the details tonight, it's fitting to turn to you and look at what is working. Career prosecutors doing their job, career prosecutors identifying individual one for directing this, because that's what the facts show. Apparently, they're not afraid of what that means, or that Donald Trump will get in there. They don't have the same buffers that the Mueller prosecution team does. And that, I should note, is the Southern District of New York, where Donald Trump famously invited then U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara to Trump Tower for the very rare and unusual step of having a meeting with the person who was the prosecutor for his jurisdiction, trying to cultivate him. When that didn't work out, firing him. Preet Bharara has gone on to detail all of that. Gosh, it looks pretty different now that we know that is the office that was going to go forward and give a 4-year recommended jail sentence to Trump's then lawyer Cohen, and recommend that and say that Trump directed it. Jennifer?
Right. I think there are about 4 or 5 key reassuring things that we can draw from the events over the last few hours. The first is that facts matter. And the facts in this case do not turn on the credibility of a single individual, whether it's Cohen, whether it's Manafort. Obviously, the special prosecutor has a wealth of information. The Southern District has a wealth of information, documentary, other witnesses, emails, texts. And so facts do matter. We've gotten so used to saying, well, nothing matters because Trump makes stuff up. You know, that doesn't work in court, because finally we have the facts. They're presented to a court. A judge is going to rule on sentencing. This is the real show. So facts do matter. Secondly, you have a slight difference of opinion here, which shows how independent that Southern District of New York is. Remember, the Southern District of New York is only involved with Cohen on the issue of the campaign finance issues. Mueller with everything else. He has perhaps been more helpful with Mueller, which is why Mueller is willing to be more lenient, but he really hasn't given enough, or in the opinion of the Southern District, enough to justify a significant reduction in penalty. And so you see these two branches of the Justice Department, which are all under the executive branch, taking slightly different positions. That's not bad. That's reassuring. That's saying people are exercising their independent judgment based upon the specific case before them, which is different, and based upon the facts before them, which is different. So that should be reassuring, that all this bullying of the Justice Department has really amounted to nothing, because people are doing their job and proceeding. I think the third point that we should have is that it is going to be impossible, I think, at this point, to either withhold a final report, if we ever have a final report, and or fire Mueller, because what he is doing and what the Southern District is doing are now creating a parallel report, if you will, in the public domain, through the courts, through these filings. So we are getting to know in real time the extent of that information. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube once that's out there. So in some ways, they've created some protection for themselves. And I think the final thing we should keep in mind is these people who have been enabling Trump, whether it's Rudy Giuliani, whether it's people in the White House who think it's fine to lie for this guy, it's fine to lie to the public, you can do whatever you want because your only client, your only responsibility is to Trump. Those people are in a heck of a lot of trouble, because those people may now be involved in actions which constitute obstruction of justice. The fraud exception will be make it impossible for lawyers to hide behind the attorney-client privilege. And this should be a warning to people who work in government and to lawyers that you must conduct yourself within the confines of the law.
That you have ethical and legal obligations. I want to do a lightning round with my large Mueller Friday Brady Bunch panel here. Yes or no, lightning round, yes or no, do the events and filings of today increase the legal exposure of individual one, Donald Trump? Yes or no? John?
Absolutely, yes.
Nancy?
Absolutely, yes.
Maya?
Oh, yeah.
Neil Katyal?
100%.
Jennifer?
Oh, yes.
Ken Delanian?
The answer is yes, because this has been the most consequential day yet of the Mueller investigation.
That is quite a statement, given how many days there have been. I want to give a special thanks to our entire panel and the legal analysis here. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.